Hi, you may want to be switching to Blender from another software like Maya or Max. And if that's the case, then you're in the same boat as I was about half a year ago. I was using Maya for a very long time professionally, and before that I was using Max. And so I dramatically switched to Blender, and there's some things that I learned doing that made my life easier, and some mistakes that I made that uh, that I think would make your life easier if you don't make the same mistakes. So I'll go over some of them. And so when you install Blender, this is and you open Blender, this is kind of what you'll get. And it may look a little bit foreign to you, but if you're used to working with 3D applications, you'll start to recognize stuff and you'll get used to it. So by default, I mean, you can look at other videos to get like the basics, which I'll show you in a bit, the other resources that you can use. But Blender has a kind of a unique navigation setup by default that is kind of different from the other software. So you may be inclined to go into File, User Preferences, Input, and then change the default setup to something like 3D Max or Maya. This is what I did initially. I changed it to Maya. Do not do that. Stick with the Blender setup and get used to it. If you switch to Maya or Max, it will have somewhat of a trickle-down effect on other hotkeys, and you'll lose a lot of the power in Blender, the innate power that Blender has, because there's a lot of stuff fundamentally in the way that you use hotkeys and the way you navigate that allow you to work really fast in Blender. And if you switch to Maya or Max layouts, key layouts, then that's gonna slightly screw that up. So when I started originally, I switched to Maya and I ran into problems when I talked to some people who had switched to Blender as well from Maya. They told me switch back to the Blender setup and just get used to it because it's gonna be much better in the long run. And so that's what I did, and I completely agree. So if you're just checking out Blender right now, it's a little bit of a pain in the ass, but just stick with it. Use the Blender setup. There's a bunch of other stuff that you might want to change. That as you're working, you'll figure that out. So one of the things, just very briefly, is that by default, this is gonna be set to right instead of left. So when you want to select something, you press by default with your right mouse button. So now I'm clicking with my right mouse button. With your left mouse button by default, you're putting this weird little thing, which is the 3D cursor. I'll go over that briefly in a second, but yeah, that's something that's going to freak you out a little bit. So by default, it'll be that left click is going to be the 3D cursor, and right click is going to be select, which is a bit alien to most people. So I switch it to left click to select stuff, and then I think I changed a few other things related to rotation and inverting the scroll, zoom, and stuff like that. Like very minor stuff, nothing that's a big deal. I think that's about it. I mean, there might be some other stuff, but like I said, if you're used to working with 3D software, then you'll figure a lot of this stuff out yourself. So don't worry too much about that. Okay, so let me talk about the 3D cursor stuff, which is very alien to most 3D users. This is basically something that you place wherever you want. If you press Shift C, it'll put it on the 000 world coordinates, and your left click, in my case now, is just to select stuff, and then you can drag and move stuff. So let me just drag and move this cube, and I'll put this cursor here, right? Now, something I can do, if I rotate, I'm just going to press R to rotate. I'm rotating around the object's origin, and you can see that here. So now I'm rotating around I think it's the active element, or no, around the median point. So if I change this to 3D cursor, basically it's going to put the pivot of the object. Not really. I should rephrase that. The pivot is still exactly here, where the orange dot is, but it's gonna rotate now around wherever my 3D cursor is. And this applies also to when you wanna rotate faces or something like that. So that's mainly where the 3D cursor is useful in modeling, is that you can kind of set a fake pivot point for modeling or rotating stuff. So while I'm rotating stuff, let me talk a little bit about the transform tools very briefly. I'll put everything back to, sorry, no, put everything back, put the cursor back as well. So those are just some power shortcuts or hotkeys, don't worry about that. And then you have a panel here as well, which is hidden. And here I can reset my rotation. There we go. Okay. So by if you want to move something or translate something, you can use the whatever they're called, the axes. But you can also just press G, which stands for grab, and then you can just grab stuff, right? If while I'm not holding G now, I've released G. While you have this, if you left click, you will release it and let it be where it is. I'm gonna press Alt G now to put it back to 0, 0, 0. So again, I'm gonna press G and I'm moving stuff while I have this selected, and while I have this grabbed, essentially, if I press Y, I'm gonna start snapping it to the Y axis, right? All I've done is pressed Y. I'm not holding Y. If I now press X, it's gonna move on the X axis. If I press Z, it's gonna move on the Z axis. So this is really useful in modeling. It's kind of a very quick snapping functionality, and Blender is full of this kind of stuff. So I'm just gonna release this now, or left click to release it, and put it back on 0, 0, 0. And again, this applies also in edit mode. So in poly mode, I can grab and then just move it on any axis. Okay. So, all right. So you see me using these kind of pie tools. By default, that won't be enabled. And to enable it, you just have to go to User Preferences, Add-ons, and then if you type here, pie, there you go. Then you can enable the pie menus. It's kind of, I believe it's by default turned off if you install Blender, but it is installed. And I recommend immediately turning it on and getting used to using the pie menus, because it'll, again, allow you to work so much faster. So turn on the pie menus. And then the basic pie menu is pressing the tab, and then you can go into edit mode, to select stuff, and you can go into object mode to select the whole object. And then there's a whole bunch of other keys that you can use the pie stuff with, but I'm not gonna give you a keyboard layout on that stuff. You can figure it out yourself. So there's some other hidden stuff, like if you rotate, so I pressed R, and I'm not holding R, I just pressed R once, and it's sort of locked in rotate now. If I left click, it's gonna release it, right? So let me do that again. I'll press R, but if I press R again, now I'm in trackball mode. So it's basically allowing me to rotate the object from a different point of view, I think. I don't know exactly how to describe this technically. But it's very useful, because the alternative would be that you have to rotate your camera, rotate it like that, rotate your camera, rotate it like that. And now you can basically rotate like this and then rotate like that, So there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of this kind of hidden functionality that you'll only figure out after using Blender for quite a while. But this is the kind of stuff that makes Blender really powerful for modeling. So I'll briefly go to another significant thing about Blender, and it's the modifiers. Just minimize this a little bit, maximize this. The modifier tab is, well, this is the outliner, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. This is my cube, right? And then here you have the what is this called? The object preferences, the properties panel. You can change this to anything else, and you can make additional panels and all that stuff. I'm not going to go over that now. This is the default setup. So here you'll see a bunch of buttons in the properties, the object's properties, and some of these, this will be a little bit confusing, some of these are related specifically to this object, and some of these are like global stuff, like this is a global thing. It's the scene. I don't know exactly why Blender has this shown when you select an object, but that's just how it's set up. You see when I switch between the camera and the cube, some of these things change, and like the properties, well, let me just give you an example. I'll duplicate this cube and I'll go into the modifier tab of this cube and add a modifier. I'm gonna add a mirror, something like that. You're not seeing it being applied because the origin is here, but don't worry about that. I've added a mirror. If I select this cube, there's no modifier here, so obviously these two are different. But if I go into, let's say, render, and I change a parameter here, let's say I'll switch this to 30%, and I go to this one, you see that this is nothing to do with the actual object that I selected, this tab. But for some reason, you can access it, no matter what you have selected. It's one of those things that's probably a little bit confusing in the beginning, but then you just don't give a shit about it after a while. So let me talk a little bit about the modifier tab. The modifier tab is kind of important because it allows you to do something with your object in a non-destructive way. So for example, let me add a subdivision. So I'll subdivide essentially the object. So this is, I can tweak it however I want. And when I go into edit mode, you'll see that I'm basically editing the original version of the object. And I can change this at any point. And when I want, I can apply this modifier. If I apply it, I do have to go back to object mode and then apply, and now it's applied to the object. So it's kind of a non-destructive way of doing stuff with your object. And there's a whole bunch of these. So let's say that I'm just gonna delete this stuff. One very useful one is the solidify modifier. So I'm gonna create a plane. There we go. And I am going to add some. So I'm gonna subdivide it a little bit. I'll press W and subdivide. And here I can change this. This is kind of the properties of the tool that I just used, and this will fade in and out depending on which tool you're using. And when I select something else or do something else, it's changed, and I cannot go back to the other one. So it's a linear properties panel. So let me again select all the faces, and I will subdivide and increase the cuts. There we go. All right, so I'll go back to object, and maybe I will move some of these first, and I will go into soft selection by pressing O. There we go, and go back to object. So now if I add a modifier to this object, specifically the solidify, what solidify does is it basically, I guess it just adds, it kind of extrudes the whole object and gives it thickness basically. So if I increase this a little bit, and you'll see it's basically solidifying the object. If I now add a bevel to the object and change the width a little bit like this, and you'll see it's beveling basically all the edges here. You can change the angle of that. I'm not going to be bothered with that right now. So I'm gonna add another one, the subdivision surface. There we go, and let's increase this a little bit. So now I essentially have 3 modifiers on this object. I can still go into edit mode and tweak stuff, and Max users will be very familiar with this setup. Obviously, well, maybe this is not obvious, but I can change the order of these modifiers. And when I do, it's gonna have some kind of effect. So for example, if I move the subdiv modifier up above the bevel, you see it's screwing up my setup a little bit. If I move it up again, it screwed it up again. It didn't screw it up, it just changed the order in which it applies stuff. So in this case, it is, let me see if I don't want to like tell you something wrong, but I believe that it's from the top down. So the first one that applies the subdivision, then you have the solidify, and then on top of that there's the bevel. So basically it's applying, let me just disable the let's see if I can show this in a different way. Okay, this is a good example. So I turned off the subdivision for a second. So what it's doing here now is it's applying the bevel on this flat plane. So it's only beveling, as you can see, these edges here. You know, the only edges that are available, basically. Because I'm using the solidify after using the bevel, none of these new edges are being beveled. But if I move the bevel after the solidify, you'll notice that these edges are. It's a basic kind of concept. There's nothing complicated about it. So this is quite powerful, and you can apply them in whichever order you want, but just pay attention to, you know, the order of them. And if you get a weird result, it may be because the order is a bit off. And there's a whole bunch of modifiers, a lot of cool stuff that you can check out and mess around with. So I think that's about the basics that you'll need to get started. My Blender looks very different than the default setup at the moment. So this is how my Blender looks like. It's basically a you know, a different UI color, and you can change all of that in the themes. You can install new themes and stuff like that. And then I have a whole bunch of additional tools, add-ons that I installed, which allow me to do stuff like this, for example. You know, like a kind of an array. You can use the array, but I'm able to access them in a non-linear way through this kind of pie menu, which is an add-on. So I have a whole bunch of these kind of stuff installed, like really powerful and very useful modeling add-ons. And I'll go over those in another video, the ones that I use and the ones that I think are very useful and powerful. But I just want to give you an idea that you can modify your Blender however you want. You can change the layout. You can add a window, like you can add a UV window, and then I can add a, let's say, a node, which is a very basic setup if you want a texture and UV or stuff. So you can customize your Blender however you want. If you want to close menus, you just drag them up, basically. I always get the order wrong. There you go, and then you can always change the window itself to something else. So let me talk a little bit about, before I end this video, about some very useful resources that will get you started from scratch, and then some more advanced resources. I think you'll find everything you need on YouTube. You don't need to buy any advanced, you know, tutorials and stuff like that. So this one is a very good resource. It's called Born CG, and it's very what's the word for it? Like you'll find everything that you'll need to understand the basics of Blender on this YouTube channel. So I highly recommend this channel to just get a full overview of Blender. I mean, this guy has been doing it for quite a long time, so you know anything you'll need to understand, you'll find on Blender on this channel. Just all the basic stuff. And then there's Blender Guru, which is kind of a little bit more advanced, but there's also a lot of useful stuff on here. And then there's CG Cookie Blender, which is also a very good resource to figure out some advanced stuff in Blender. And then I'll move on to one that's a decent amount more advanced, and this is a YouTube channel by a guy called Cedric Lepellier, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. Lepellier, I think it is. So this guy is a really fantastic add-on creator for Blender. He's a scripter, Python scripter, or I don't know what to call him, but he is fantastic. The tools that he's made are really, really awesome. A lot of the tools you have to pay for. Um, Not all of them. Like this speed topo is completely free. But then you have some more advanced stuff like the speed flow, which I'm using, um, which is I think it costs something like $15 or $30. I don't know. If you are a professional 3D artist, I think it is worth it. And if you're using Blender, I think his stuff is really worth it, and it's really powerful. It kind of shows you how what you can do with Blender. Another one that is kind of in the same category is this guy called Master Xeon. Uh, he has some he has a really powerful or a few really powerful add-ons that he developed with some other people. One of them is called what is it called? Hardops. And Hardops is a really powerful kind of hard surface prototyping tool that doesn't use subdivision um, modeling, but you don't need subdivision modeling for the method that he shows. And he has a lot of videos where he shows the tool in action. It's also not free, but those are kind of advanced tools that are really. So I highly recommend checking this stuff out once you get used to Blender a bit. And I think that's about it. I'm not sure if there was any. There's some other. There's just search for Blender tutorial on YouTube, and you'll get a ridiculous amount of resources. The other thing that I found working with Blender that has really been very just really great experience is that every time or 99% of the time that I'm stuck modeling and I'm thinking, there has to be a better way of doing this, or I wonder if I can do this. I go on the internet and I look it up and I find the answer. And like I said, 99% of the time, the thing that I want to do with Blender, it's out there. I can do it. I just didn't know how to do it, but it's out there. And one good resource for that is Stack Exchange, Blender Stack Exchange. I'll link to it in the description. It's a very good resource to get answers about Blender. There's some really powerful users in there. And another one is just the Blender Reddit page is a good resource as well. So I think I'll end my video on that. And if you have any specific questions about transitioning from Maya or Max to Blender that you want to ask, just feel free to add them in the comments. I'll follow up this channel with some more specific videos and some more specific character creation techniques using Blender that have been very useful to me. And I think probably the next video that I'll do is gonna be kind of a breakdown of the add-ons that I'm using and just my general setup at the moment, which is constantly changing, but I'll give you a snapshot of my current setup. All right, see you guys later.